It's just the finish line.
All right, how's everyone doing? Good. I know that you're excited to talk about your assignments. We'll do that at the end.
Let's have it out. No worries.
So why we all start getting ready for the session, as you know, we start at 6:10. I promised that I would try to create incentives for people to arrive earlier, right? So Judith, is there something that a story that you'd like to share off the record to motivate our students? Exactly.
Let's see, a story I'd like to share off the record. Well, one thing, I was born in Brooklyn, New York, so it's always nice to come to New York. Even though I'm going to be with you for a very short period of time, I just arrived from Washington a few hours ago. I'm very happy to say that I will be taking home some bagels from Italy. So thank you for that opportunity, not only to talk to you, but to bring bagels for my So I appreciate that.
I thought you were gonna share with them like how something about IDB's presence and soccer skills.
Okay, that's another story I can share with you. We have a brand new, or not brand new, but we have a president who started in December of last year. His name is Elon Goldfein. And Dr. Goldfein actually is a very avid soccer player. So when we had our annual meeting, he actually scored a winning goal. Not only did he score a winning goal, but I've also learned more and more about his soccer pursuits from as young as college. I was talking to a professor this morning at UT Austin. His name is Marcelo Paixão. And he's a Brazilian who's very dynamic. I call him the Brazilian Cornel West. If you haven't heard him speak, he's really exciting. And he was telling me a story about soccer, playing soccer with the president of the IDB and a soccer injury even. So yes, we have lots and lots of soccer, or futebol no escritório.
What's the soccer team?
Flamengo.
Alright.
Flamengo.
So you never come across.
Alguém que não gosta de Flamengo torce para outro time. Só eu, São Paulo.
So here's a hint for all of you. If you ever come across the president of IDB and want to start a conversation, get them excited, just mention Flamengo.
Definitely. We now have even a artwork piece that has Flamengo. It's from many decades ago, but it's very exciting for everything coming.
All right. We're starting in a couple of minutes. Camila? It's all set?
Yes, we're all set.
Okay, are you on YouTube already? Looks like I am set.
Yeah.
Okay, live to the world, directly from School of International Public Affairs. Welcome back. This is the first public session actually that we are having, and it's a great pleasure to have Judith here with us. I'll introduce her momentarily. And give me 1 second because I prepare some notes to get us started today. By the way, just Camila, just double check once again. Can you hear us well, or should I bring the microphone closer to
I can hear you well. Yeah, it's
Okay.
good.
Thanks a lot. I've mentioned in the past that some topics that are newer in the policy agenda, and one of them is race and social inclusion. So it's a great pleasure for us to have included this particular topic in our classes over the past few years. And it's an even greater pleasure to have a distinguished speaker coming from Washington, D.C. to be with us today. The intrinsic complexity of racial and social disparity in Brazil is not only deeply interwoven with the country's history, but is also part of our contemporary society. We observe disparities in economic outcomes, labor opportunities, and access to fundamental services between diverse racial and ethnic groups, despite the absence of a race-based laws in Brazil, mostly. A pressing question looms upon us. How might discussing race and inclusion through the lens of social policies can pave a pathway towards diminishing the income gap among underserved and discriminated populations in Brazil? Subtle, yet persistent racial discrimination, deeply rooted in social norms and practices, indirectly perpetuates educational and occupational disparities among racial lines, subsequently influencing income differentials. Furthermore, the relationship between race, class, and income in Brazil signals a crucial need to dissect and understand the determinants of racial inequality in the labor market. Today's discussion, enriched by our esteemed guest speaker, aims to navigate the intricacies of these issues, proposing a reflexive dialogue that explores and assesses current social policies, their impacts, and future trajectories in fostering a more socially inclusive Brazil. Judith Morrison served as a senior advisor at the Inter-American Development Bank in Washington, D.C., where she is responsible for leading analytical and development initiatives to fully incorporate marginalized communities in lending strategy and operations. Prior to joining the IDB, she was the regional director for South America and the Caribbean at the Inter-American Foundation, the executive director of the Interagency Consultation in Latin America, a donor consortium established by the World Bank. And previously, she was a program director at Inter-American Dialogue. So with great pleasure, once again, we're very pleased to have you, Judith, back in New York, and especially for the first time with us here at SIPA.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Before I get started, boa tarde. Quem fala português, levanta a mão. Tá, então quase todo mundo fala português. Okay, good. My presentation is a little bit multilingual, and we'll talk about that towards the end, kind of how I got into international development. As I mentioned, I'm from Brooklyn. I have no Brazilian background, but I've always had a great deal of affinity for the country. And that maybe is another special treat for you guys to hear a little bit more about. I really like that introduction about the importance of talking about race and ethnicity in Brazil. And I guess I should just stand up and get the clicker. Is that right, Sydney? Okay, perfect. And I don't mind standing up. Sometimes it's a lot of fun to sit up when you're talking. At least that way I don't fall asleep as I'm talking. Oops, sorry. But very quickly here.
Sorry, Judith, and if you prefer, you can always look at the screen, like
Look at here.
Yeah.
Okay, super. So I just wanted to show you this map because this map shows you the concentration of the Afro-descendant population in Brazil. When we're talking about Brazil, there's lots and lots of racial and ethnic diversity, right? It's the largest population of Japanese.
Can you just move because the window there is in front of me?
Okay. So maybe
Very much.
I'm not sure how to manage it. So we know that Brazil has one of the largest Japanese populations outside of Japan, has had migration from all over the world. It's extraordinarily diverse. In fact, some people say the Brazilian passport is one of the most valuable passports in the world because almost anyone can be or look Brazilian. So I really want to focus this conversation on the notion of race. So when we think about race, often we're talking about race as being physical appearance. So race is often used to describe African descendants because of race, like it's something that you see. When we talk about ethnicity, that's often culture and values. So you can be Afro-descendant or of like a Black race, but then you have multiple layers of ethnicity. You can be Afro-Cuban, or in the case of Brazil, you could be from Minas, you could have lots of different ethnics. You could be from Bahia, you could be from Sao Paulo, you could be from Porto Alegre, you could have a lot of different expressions or ways of being Afro-Gaúcho, for example, right? So that's kind of your ethnicity. It's an important distinction when we're talking about Latin America, because for most people, when we say race and ethnicity or ethno-racial, we're generally talking about Afro and Indigenous. And so one of the first slides I'm going to show you, this is a concentration slide. So what this means is you can see how heavily concentrated the Afro-descendant population is in Brazil vis-a-vis the rest of the region. The region is about 30% Afro-descendant, about 10% Indigenous. So this is a big deal. I mean, it basically means that Brazil has the largest African descendant population outside of continental Africa. And if it was in continental Africa, it would be the second largest after Nigeria. So we're talking about a really substantial population that has not been studied. I started my work back in the late 90s looking at Comunidades Quilombolas in Maranhão in the northeast of Brazil. At the time, I was told Quilombolas didn't exist, that it was something of Zumbi dos Palmares, that it was a mythology, that they weren't real. Many people said they'd never heard of Quilombo communities, and many people in the Northeast told me that they had never heard of an Afro-Brazilian. So we'll talk about the complexity of how people describe themselves and how people describe their context. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about is actually related to race vis-a-vis development. So I'm actually very optimistic about understanding race and development. And this shows you a little bit of the importance of Brazil. This is older data. And what's interesting about it is better harmonized because it's all from more or less the same year. We have newer data sets, but they're skewed in lots of different ways. So I wanted to just show you that if we're looking at the largest Afro-descendant in absolute numbers, by far it's Brazil, with almost 100 million people. If we look at Indigenous population by absolute numbers, it's Mexico, Peru, Bolivia. Now, for Afro-descendants, Brazil, Colombia, and Ecuador in that order. For absolute numbers, but what's really curious here, so if we think about big Afro-descendant populations in Latin America, Brazil's number 1, Colombia's number 2, Ecuador's number 3, Mexico is actually number 5, which is often shocking to people, but it's because the population of Mexico is so large. And there's actually a very large policy movement even to discuss issues of Afro-descendants in Mexico because of the size. When we think about Brazil, and I mentioned Porto Alegre, and people say kind of like, oh, Porto Alegre is the south of Brazil and it's so European. And I can tell you many anecdotes about having people tell me that everyone, in the south of Brazil is European. Porto Alegre has an Afro-Brazilian population of 24%. The US's population is about 14. So even Porto Alegre is significantly more of Afro descent than the US. I will tell you an anecdote. I actually arrived in Porto Alegre and went to a German restaurant with somebody I met on the plane, which was kind of random. I wouldn't recommend doing that. But when I got to the German restaurant, this guy said to me, oh, you're going to really have this great German food. It's going to be so authentic and it's going to be right from Germany. You won't believe it. And sure enough, everyone in the kitchen was Afro-Brazilian. So again, when you have a population that's 24%, that's very, very substantial. Sushi places. So when we think about this, is actually a study that we worked at through the bank to understand better the labor market in Sao Paulo. When we look at these darker areas, the darker blue, these are areas that have the highest concentration of jobs. So it's Pinheiros, it's Vila Mariana, it's Sei. And then, so the conversation often is around, it's really hard to get Afro-Brazilians to labor market destinations where jobs are concentrated. Just take a look though, when we look at these numbers, so Ipiranga and several of the others, anywhere you have an orange triangle is where the population, the Afro-Brazilian population is over 30%. So all around these central business districts, you have large, substantial 30+% Afro-descendant population up to 50%. So it shows you just kind of how widespread, and obviously many of you know Brazil well, know that Sao Paulo has one of the largest Afro-descendant populations in all of Brazil. specifically the municipality of Sao Paulo because it's so large. I want to say this, I'll go on an ethnicity side note very quickly. If any of you have ever been to Paleiros here in the south of the municipality of Sao Paulo, fascinating. They actually have aldeias where people speak Guarani and do not speak Portuguese. So that is within the municipality of Sao Paulo, just to show you how incredibly diverse and incredibly large Sao Paulo is. So when we think about race and ethnicity, the most important, o carro-chefe, is self-identification. We want people to describe themselves. It's hard for people to describe themselves. You guys are here in the United States right now. Those of you who may be from Latin America may be asked, you may be filling out a census form, you may be filling out a form for school. You don't really know what to say. It's complicated, very complicated. In fact, it's complicated in part because of the categories that are used in the United States that don't always recognize Brazilian identity as being Latin identity. And there's a lot of complication around the notion of Hispanic and what happens to Lusophone speakers, right? So you have that kind of in your mind, but it's also complicated if you're in Brazil. Why? Because people's race and ethnicity and their perception of their race and ethnicity may change. There's a famous study, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on in the presentation. But what's fascinating about Brazil and the way that race has been defined in Brazil is around color. That gives Brazil a huge advantage when we're talking about development data. It means the categories haven't changed every couple of years. If we look at other countries, when you change the definition, what happens is people identify in different ways. It happened in Chile, where we had a change in the definition where people began identifying themselves as indigenous. If you kind of use Afro-Brazilian, it's kind of pardo, preto, amarelo, branco. And now recently there's an indigenous category, which is actually helpful and is something that people can put on top of the color. So you're not just pardo, but you can be pardo and indigenous, right? I just wanted to make a quick reference to a publication that I worked on last year with a co-author that's called Diversity Data in the Social Sector. So if any of you are interested, it talks about the ways you can classify. So for example, Uruguay, which also has a pretty racially mixed Afro-descendant population in particular, talks about your primary identity and your secondary identity. So you can say, I'm European, but actually I also am kind of Afro-descendant. So it gives you ways of kind of nuancing and discussing race, which is extremely interesting when we're talking about access to opportunities. The other thing that I often say is that sometimes it's challenging for people to identify themselves. We even have this challenge sometimes in work settings where people don't want to necessarily declare their race or ethnicity in the office place because they feel that maybe by saying they're one race or another, they're somehow going to be labeled or identified as being activist, or I mean, it's very, the political context and the social context are very complex when you ask these questions, which is why it's important sometimes to put safeguards in place. So you tell people it's anonymous, you tell people it's separate, you ask the question because visibly someone could look one way to the census taker, and that's not really reflective of how they feel or of their actual identity. One of the things that we did in the office several years ago is we actually asked the question, what is the race or ethnicity of your mother or father? We also asked about language, which was a really interesting way to nuance and understand indigenous identity. So if someone said, and people often are much more comfortable talking about their parents' race and ethnicity than their own. I see this pretty consistently. So if you're in a smaller setting, or if you're doing a survey for perhaps for a public municipal office or for funcionarios públicos, it might be easier for you to ask the question that way to get a better sense of who's actually being represented within your workplace. Whoops, what have I done? Okay, I wanted to talk a little bit about descriptive terms. So these are just a couple of the terms that I wanted to pull out for you. Amorenada, bem morena, branca queimada, corada. Those of you, and there's lots and lots. Oscuro, criollo, retinto, pardo. This one is not quite as creative. If you looked at older lists from the 70s and from the 60s, you'll even find café com leite, cor do bombom, lots of very crazy words that people use to describe themselves. And what we try to do when we're thinking about development data, so it's often helpful to categorize these. And so you kind of can put them all under an umbrella. And what's interesting is when we put a lot of these terms under the umbrella, the term that we're really talking about is some sort of variation of being Afro-descendant. Right? So if you're café con leite ou café puxado mais pro crema com não sei o quê, this is usually a very euphemistic way for people to talk about race. Some of the words are so silly sounding. And part of the reason also, when you really look at the historical context for this, many of these words are only really used for women. You might not necessarily use them for men. And they're often used for Afro-descendants or variations of being Afro-descendant, maybe Afro-Indigenous sometimes, but it's almost always someone who's not branco or white. So there's a history that comes about when we think about concubinage, and I talk to people who are from the US. If you think of octrons or quadroons, things like that in the US, it's a holdover from slavery, and quite frankly, it's a holdover from sexual exploitation. So it's a way of describing someone very specifically. So, you know, it's a woman who's kind of brown, but has kind of blue eyes or has like straight hair. I mean, it's this kind of very nuanced things that are really about commercialization and quite frankly, a historic sex trade, right? So I want to make sure that we're kind of clear about where these terms come from. This is an analysis that was done in '98 of a couple of the official statistics and how people were auto-identificando. So these are things that people put, again, you see the same kind of marrom, moreno escura, preta, parda, sarará, morena, jambo. Again, these are all kind of ways of saying that you're kind of sort of Black, right? Or you're kind of sort of African. There are the top ones are the ones that are used most frequently for people of European origin. If you notice, it's interesting that brasileiro, or, you know, how many of you guys have heard, you know, branco brasileiro, right? And so this is just kind of, so if you're brasileiro, that's kind of default proxy for being branco, right? Or something maybe that's not quite branco, who knows? So many terms have been used to describe race. We talked a little bit about the gender dimension. The terminology needs to be consistent with common use. So if you're going to introduce, and in Brazil, we don't have to worry about that because we're not introducing new categories, but people may introduce their own new categories. So at some point, I don't know, maybe there's a song that comes out that's, you know, funky, and that people decide that they want to call themselves this new term. You have to kind of understand what does that mean, and you have to understand how to classify it as a researcher. I wanted to flag some of the favela studies because when we do longitudinal data, and there are a couple of really nice longitudinal favela studies, people actually do have a tendency to self-identify as less and less Black over time, especially if they become more and more wealthy. So the very same individual at 20 or 25 may be considering themselves pardo or even preto, but by the time they're 40 or 45, they may be embranquecendo, right? So they're getting lighter and lighter, or they're self-identifying in a different way. It's interesting. There was a big movement back in the 90s that was somos negros y favelados, right? So we're Black and we're from favelas. So there was also this, which is kind of almost a South African concept of being Black, being kind of equated with marginalized and almost a vindication, right? So this negro y favelado. I don't know if that's maybe coming into play in terms of people's self-identification. Perhaps they're more involved with social movements when they're younger. As they get older, they're less involved, or they're becoming a little bit, you know, more wanting to fit in a little bit more with notions of European identity. For me, this is the most important, that very last box. I don't really worry about how people classify themselves. What I worry about as a development practitioner is if that identity or that individual, the way they look, if that's a factor for exclusion from development opportunities, that's what I want to understand. That's why it's nice to have these terms to understand what people are saying, but it's nice to be able to look at trends over time and to be able to make inferences and to look at where there are policy gaps. Because we can see pretty consistently across Latin America, and Brazil is no exception, that the race that you're born has an impact on your outcomes, your access to education, your access to healthcare, your access to economic opportunities. That's why at the end of the day, this is important. It's important because we want to ensure that people have equal access to opportunities, not just because it's good for individuals, but it's good for society. If your society is over 50% African descendant, and we know that your race is one of the primary indicators of your income, access to education, and health outcomes, it's a huge problem. So it means no matter how well educated you are, you're going to be facing consistent barriers, and you're not going to be able to reach your full potential to be able to fully contribute to the economic and social lives of your countries, right? So this isn't something like, just a human rights lens. This is really the core of development, because we're talking about populations that are huge. These are huge populations in the region, and that represent a very disproportionate number of the poor. The region as a whole, I mentioned earlier, is about 30% Afro-descendant, but Afro-descendants represent about 50% of the poor. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about expanding opportunities. And this is some of the really good news. More than half the populations of African descent, but more than half of Afro-Brazilians are in the middle class. That's 53 million people. One of the things that we've seen recently is that Afro-Brazilians have slightly different tendencies for spending. Afro-Brazilians, when they reach the middle class, tend to invest in things like computers and education for their children, right? So these are very interesting factors that are racial and ethnic differences, but it shows that people are making an investment in their future. We also know that 75% of the population that became middle class in the last decade in Brazil is of African descent. That's very substantial. It means that many of the social programs have been effective and that opportunities have been expanding in labor markets. We also know that Afro-Brazilians, their income represents about 1/5 of Brazil's total GDP. So again, large populations, some really good news, expanding access to educational opportunities, a growing middle class. There's a lot to be really excited about in Brazil. Now, one thing I just want to mention very quickly, because so many of you are from Brazil, or at least you said you speak Portuguese, so I'm assuming that you're probably from Brazil. If you look at Brazil and you look at public policy over time, and you look at job requirements, when I started working in Brazil in the 90s, very few people spoke English. Wasn't a requirement for most jobs. If you look at jobs now, English is a requirement for many jobs, and fluent English is a requirement for many jobs. And fluent, like natively fluent English. When I go to Brazil, I speak a lot in. I talk to other Americans, I talk to other people on the street, and people come up to me and say, "Nossa, menina, você fala tão bem o inglês." You speak English so well. Because what's happening is that people are actually, who are Brazilian, are like speaking in the streets in English to one another. Right? And the reason I'm mentioning it is that I think it's a potential factor for exclusion. It's one thing to be able to speak English well, to be able to read, to be able to write, to be able to interact with literature and people from another country. It's another thing to have native level English, because one of the things with the companies that we've been working with, I often say, well, why do you need to have native English? Like, do you have English customers? Like, are you running call centers? Like, who do you need to speak to in this native English? The other area that if you look at a lot of business terminology within just the last 4 or 5 years has switched almost entirely into English. So if you don't know English, you can't follow a conversation about business terminology. I'm flagging all of these things because, as we know, the access to education, particularly higher education, has expanded exponentially in Brazil. But now you may need to have native English. And you may need to have a postdoc, right? You need to go to the US to do something. And I know people even who are very seasoned professionals who are like, tô fazendo postdoc. This is like a postdoc, which those of you who know, I mean, a postdoc generally means that it's kind of, you're not really getting paid. You're kind of doing a research activity or something that's very short term, and it's very expensive for people who are advanced in their career. They're essentially losing about a year's worth of income and they're moving to a different country. So again, we need to think a little bit about qualifications, matching qualifications with needs, and how Brazil is growing and how there are certain ways that there may be new barriers for exclusion. Oops. I hope I didn't. Oh, did I just walk all the way? What did I do? Yeah.
Share spawns, what are we playing again?
Is it still?
To resume share, so you're gonna be on the top.
Okay. Okay, perfect. Resume share. Okay.
I'm here.
Which one, this one?
It's some.
Oh, it's behind there. Okay, so I wanted to talk to you guys precisely thinking about diagnostic tools, right? So these are some of the things that we look at when we think about changes within the labor market, when we think about where are the new possibilities or the new frontiers for potential exclusion. One of the things that's wonderful about working on race and ethnicity in Brazil is the quality of the data sets. It's also very daunting because they're huge. So I'm going to talk to you about a couple of data sets that we developed specifically for the federal government in Brazil. We had one of the data sets alone had over 50 million students that we were analyzing for access to labor markets. When we have data sets, sometimes they're spread across different sectors. These were data sets that were used specifically to analyze the development of racial and ethnic inclusion policy. And the third is there weren't really established set of indicators. So at the time, the government agency is called CEPIR, that was our client for this project. They had to monitor two kinds of types of large scale policies. They needed to have indicators with data that was available through multiple sectors. And I'll talk to you a little bit about how we overcame some of these barriers. So we had to look at the Cadastro Único to be able to understand what was happening at the individual level, particularly for people who were the most disadvantaged. And what we decided to do is to focus on rural communities, on comunidades quilombolas, because there is a specific government program for quilombolas, and also youth violence prevention for youth at risk. Some of you may be familiar with the Juventude Viva programs, right? So you're looking at homicide rates, you're looking at youth prevention. So those are the two specific areas that we looked at. And I wanted to show you a couple of these tools. So we worked on a data CEPIR and Sinapir tool. This is an example of it. This uses Google Maps. And one of the things that's so exciting about this tool is that you can burrow down into the neighborhoods and actually see infrastructure. You can map out what types of resources are available in these communities. And what we found was really helpful when we're using this tool with local governments and authorities is some of these neighborhoods are either very small, very rural, or they may, quite frankly, not have a lot of presence of the state. So it's much easier to have 50 people in a room or the number of people we have here and to look at the neighborhood or the corner. In this case, what you're seeing in the red, this is an area of high violence against youth. It's easier to do it from the office than to do a tour where you're going into the community. It's very disruptive. It's disruptive because people want to know why you're there. It also may be a little bit unsafe or intrusive. Yes.
Is it available for the public or only for officials?
This is something that we use primarily internally for the government. We did have a kind of a sample public version with a little bit of the data, but if you're interested, let me know and I can get you access. This is an example, and this is Alcântara, which is in Maranhão. As I mentioned, I did a lot of work in Maranhão, but this shows you kind of, it gives you a sense that yes, indeed, this is a very rural community, that it's a community that does have asfalto, so it's paved roads. They do have some electricity. So just some of these visual images help policymakers to be able to make certain types of determinations. There are also ways that they can do specific data generation exercises and cross information at the state level as well as the local. We use these tools as well for Sao Paulo Diverso. That was one of the maps that I showed you. So we did lots of different types of concentration maps on Sao Paulo. We also did kind of, this is analysis of homicides on the Sao Paulo level. This is kind of the improvements in access to education, which are very significant, particularly that's that last decade I was telling you about. If you look at this, 32,000 people who are Afro-Brazilian between 18 and 39 completing college, compared to 120,000 in 2010. And these are very substantial drops. That's what we're seeing here. I wanted to show you another document. This one's about 2 years old. I know you had in your reading list a couple of publications. One was CEQ, which is a fiscal incidence exercise. Essentially, Brazil's a great example of how to map racial and ethnic equality through taxation. Why? Because the population is about 50%. So it's very easy to do the modeling, and we have a couple of visual images of that modeling. essentially what the CEQ is saying is that people, whether they're Afro-Brazilian, we looked at Brazil, we looked at Uruguay, we looked at 5 countries in total, and found that these populations tend to pay more in taxes and receive less benefits, right? So the way it should, so it's a regressive tax structure. Ideally, the way it should work based on the poverty numbers that we have is the individuals who are paying the least should be receiving the most services, not the opposite way around. So it's a very interesting exercise. It's extraordinarily data intense. The publication, it took us a long time to analyze all of the data sets, but you guys have read the publication and you can see that these are kind of trends that we're seeing. The good news is that we also found that there were some issues around targeting some of the programs. And if you remember, there was Bolsa Familia, and then there was, Brasil Sem Miséria. And so there've been, these are all things that the Brazilian federal government has been working on very aggressively. And again, because the data sets are so good, we can pinpoint and understand where, bolsões of pobreza are and how race and ethnicity may be affecting. One of the things that we saw, and one of the reasons that Bolsa Familia decided to innovate and go with an even lower income group, is that there were people who were being left behind. So some of the very, very poorest of the poor, Afro-descendants and indigenous peoples, were being left out of some of the programs that were supposed to be targeting the poorest of the poor. So one of the questions that came up is it an uptake issue that people aren't aware of the programs? Is there something that's happening, maybe a moment of exclusion when people are being signed up, that maybe some of these very poor individuals are not getting access, or there's some sort of discrimination that's happening? And the Brazilian government has been amazing about targeting and really analyzing the data in depth. It's also been used as a model for Uruguay and some of the other countries that are looking heavily at issues of poverty alleviation and equal access to opportunities. This is a publication, and I've worked many years on this 500 Maiores, which is the analysis of the racial, ethnic, and gender profile of the 500 largest companies in Brazil. So I've had an opportunity to work with that program since the very beginning. There's a new one that was just launched. It's been really instrumental for moving the discussion on private sector. I don't know how many of you have followed. There was, obviously there's George Floyd during the pandemic. There was also an incident in Brazil that was, very similar, with an act of violence that took place in a big supermarket, which is generally, there's a lot of data about these supermarkets. If any of you have ever been to these hypermarkets, as they're called, people come from all different social classes. And so you have the tension, and what the kind of executives have talked to us about. If you're low income, the tension is you're spending too much, right? You're maybe spending more than you have, or you have to buy these bulk purchases. If you're upper income, the tension is often you don't feel you have enough space. You're like, oh boy, we're buying, 10,000 rolls of toilet paper, paper towel, or whatever. Where are we going to put these things? So it's actually a hotbed of social tension. It's one of the few spaces in society where you have all different classes and races and ethnicities coming together. So if you look at some of these markets, that have very aggressive programs for employee diversity. There's one that actually is one of the few companies in Latin America that has a transgender specific recruitment program. And basically they say, if you're upset because we have transgender workers, or because we have Afro-Brazilian workers, or because we have, any kind of LGBTQ plus workers, we'd rather you leave. Like, we'd rather not have you in the store. And it's because they've done a market analysis, and having someone with that level of, preconceito, or someone that has that level of kind of discriminatory mindset is like a time bomb in that space where people are grabbing for different products and things like that. So the point is that so Brazil had this kind of moment of reckoning in the private sector. And I actually would say that Brazil, I think, did an absolutely amazing job of promoting the discussion of racial and ethnic inclusion in the private sector. They used a lot of the data set from the 500 Maiores, which was the 500 largest Brazilian companies, which was an exercise that was led and financed by the IDB in collaboration with Instituto Ethos. This was a publication that we did looking at a more kind of newer data set, and there's a new one that's coming out now. It'll be interesting to see what happens. But I wanted to show you this one because this is one that you may not have followed so much. So this is the race and gender profile of the largest companies in Brazil. So a couple of things that we can see, and I apologize for those of you that don't speak Portuguese, I'll try to explain it in English. what you're seeing in the first slide is that regardless of profession, because there's often this discussion of, well, it's because, Afro-descendants go into fields that are maybe more public sector, so they don't earn as much, or, women maybe are going into fields that are less well paid, more traditionally female. What you're seeing here is that in the most professional fields, there's a gap between Afro-Brazilian women and white men that are earning almost twice in the same field. So this says doctors, lawyers, and engineers. These are the highest paid professionally trained professions in the analysis of the HAIS, which is the labor market analysis. Same is happening with gerentes, which are managers, also earning about half. And directores is very interesting because directores, we're looking at an amount of about 15,000 reais, for Black women, about 41,000 reais for white men. So it's nice when we're doing data analysis and people kind of say, well, why are you getting to such level of granularity? What's important to know and understand, because the gaps are not always consistent. And if you're going to do data sets and you're going to make comparisons, you need to be able to make comparisons against all the different types of groups to be able to understand where the gaps are and what policy measures need to be taken. Like what's interesting, if you look at these, if you look at these gaps, the difference between Black men and white women is actually not that big. Right. So the challenge is really like what's happening at that higher level for white men. Is it that the companies are so much bigger and that they're paying so much better? What's the skill set that someone needs to have to be a lawyer, an engineer, and to get into a director level position? Like, is this a question of access that people don't know where to go or how to access these jobs? Is there an information gap? Is there a training gap? Is it about the quality of the schools? These are all things that are really important. And I think in the next one, so what you'll see here, this is just, I kind of like this picture of the woman here, and it's 5%. So we know that basically, Black women are making up about 5% of these director level positions. When we did the 500 Mayores a few years back, it's amazing. We had, I think it was 0.03%. There was one woman executive who was Rachel Maya, who was in a job. And when she left that job, our statistics like disappeared. So it just shows you kind of how people are so isolated in some of these private sector positions. I don't know if you had a question.
It's not a question, it's just a comment. It's so interesting because when I did my personal statement to get into Colombia, I used those data, like
Other 500 Mayores.
yeah, and I used that to prove like my voice was needed in here in those leadership positions. So I'm like,
I'm so glad. No, and it's funny because it's a study that I worked on many years ago, and it stopped. I don't know if you know, it stopped for like 6 or 7 years. And when we put it out again, what was amazing is the numbers hadn't changed. Now, methodologically, we were a little bit nervous about putting it out and making too many comparisons because the companies are all anonymous. But what's fascinating is they're self-selecting. So what that means is if your numbers had dropped and you're self-selecting, means the situation isn't very good. And so those numbers got a lot of traction. And it's actually one of the things that I'm kind of most excited about, because it also shows you, so it shows all of us a couple of things that are important about the labor market. And one of them is this last one. Take a look at the aprendizes. If we look at this, Black women are very well represented in these kind of internship positions. When you have a paid internship that's subsidized by the government, there's complete parity. Gender parity, racial parity, sometimes you even get more Afro descendants in those positions, particularly if they're subsidized. So what we started to do is look at the difference between what's an aprendiz, what's an estagiario, what's a trainee, right? Because these are all people who are kind of entry level, but they have different levels of status within the company. And then you look at what happens after they finish this level. Many of them don't get absorbed in the companies, right? So there's something going on that we have to think about the entry level position and what are the supports that are needed. And I have a feeling some of it may be, you'll hear companies often talk about, that person wasn't a good cultural fit. So I think sometimes it's what does it mean to be a good cultural fit? I was doing work with a very large company that's very data driven. And I want to tell the story because it was amazing to me. One of the things that they did at the end of all of their processes, you had to go through a written exam, which was very mathematical and analytical. You had to go through a round of individual interviews. and then you have to go through a round of group interviews. So in the stage right before the group interviews, there are 4 Indigenous PhDs in statistics and math. 4. It's kind of cool, I thought. What happened? They said, oh, they did terribly in the group interviews. If you guys look at data on group interviews are not a good way of recruiting. One of the reasons group interviews are difficult to recruit from is that you have a pool and there are certain people that are perceived as leaders and certain people who are not. So what I asked is, well, what were you looking for? You know, what happened with these Indigenous potential candidates? Why didn't you select them? Well, they just didn't seem like a good fit. Yes.
I mean, I'm thinking about what they call culture in this case. I mean, there are a lot of like consulting firms, they do the kind of assessments to define the culture of the company. But since the company pretty much made of white people, there'll be like a white culture and they like create those criterias of the white culture to impose for new people. So but it's not a cultural fit because the consulting firm did the assessment, but they did based on what it is today. So you're not changing culture and now like hire new people. So it's kind of like the same thing rolling again and again. I'm sorry. It's just like,
No, it's a very good point. No, and it is the point, because the question is, how many of you have been in a room where you've had Indigenous leaders in the room with you? Right? So they were always either perceived as being kind of too aggressive or too passive. And often with a lens of like, oh, well, their culture is very passive, or, oh, well, they seem very aggressive. You know, it's just, you kind of don't win because the lack of familiarity of the person who's doing the assessment is driving this much more than the individual candidate. That's why even the individual interviews are much better than the group interviews. So what I advise is, please, next time, don't do group interviews, especially don't do group interviews in this way, because clearly, you know, you may be missing out on some very, very strong candidates that are not able to get through the process.
Okay, I think I have something to contribute because my whole career until now, because I changed it, is I was a recruiter. So yes, I was like human resources generalist. And in my past, I'm really looking to see my strong accents. So in my previous work, I was in Belgium and I was an international recruitment. And I was like, you know what? I will do something now that I am like in this position of power. So I was trying to hire people that were not European. And the thing is, we won, how can I say, kind of award because we had the most diversity in this company. But now that I'm here, it was for internship. It was like a trainee program. They are not staying in the company because they are not getting observed. So, which means like, I'm like questioning, did I do a good job? Because I took them out of their country and they are not being observed in the company. And also another thing is because most of the time we think about like, the recruiter didn't like me. But in the end, it's very, how can I say, in the end, it's the business decision. Like even the recruiter, we can really like the person, but it will depend on who's going to be the boss in the end of the story. And I see a lot of the times the company wants the PhD, and the diversity, but they don't listen to those people. And myself included, I don't think they listen to me. They let me like, okay, let's receive the award in the diversity, but for what? They're not getting absurd.
It's tough. And I think one of the ways to work on this, and that's one of the things that I really enjoyed about the publication, is Ethos is a group of companies that are self-identified and they want to be leaders. And they want to be leaders on social issues. They want to be leaders on environmental issues. So if you can find companies that want to push and move, that helps. One of the other areas that was really surprising when we were doing work with Sao Paulo and the municipality, we did a survey with them that was similar. So we did the 200 fornecedores do município de Sao Paulo. So it's like 500 and now it's 200. What was amazing, so these 200 suppliers, basically what they said is, they said, you know, we're actually not very diverse, but we're interested and we want to become more diverse, because many of them were actually much smaller than we had originally anticipated. They were companies of 5 or 6 people, and they tended to be more family-run companies. So they were like, we really would like to have someone from the outside, and we'd love to have someone from a diverse perspective because we're kind of all family and we all know each other. So, you know, there are ways that I think certain companies are interested. And I do feel, particularly for consumer product companies in Brazil, If you don't know the Afro-Brazilian market, you are not going to be able to make money, right? I mean, there are a number of consumer market-driven companies that need to have that perspective to be able to make money. They're not going to be competitive if they don't have it. There's lots of market studies. The big one, which maybe is less relevant now that it's X, but if you look at so-called Black Twitter in the US, Twitter was used in a radically different way by the African-American community here in the United States. Than it was used almost like a chat, like a text message. So you'd say, hey, I'm heading to, the store or to this neighborhood to do something. So it was a very different way of using the Twitter. And there's actually now research I saw just the other day, there's a documentary on kind of the role of Black Twitter and moving policy. So there are certain ways that your product, and I'm using Twitter because it's a technology company. So as new products, I'll give you another example very quickly. During the pandemic, actually, I'll save it because I'm going to show you the example and then you're going to see it. It's going to be even more important once you see the pictures for it. So this just shows you kind of the penalty of being a woman. And it looks at certain types of roles, right? So it's construction, it's health, construction, it's kind of real estate and financial services, it's general contractors. So basically it happens across the board. There's some sort of penalty in the market. It's helpful for us to understand why and to come up with policies to make things more equal and equitable, in part to promote growth within the country. Okay, so this is what I wanted to talk to you about. This is, whoops.
All right, don't mind that. But yeah.
Okay.
There's a timer.
There's a timer.
Yeah,
Okay,
exactly. Yeah,
so
just
good.
press it, yes, because you have to extend the time. Yeah.
Excellent. So this is
Thank you.
this is a loan, and this loan is to Salvador Bahia. This loan talks a lot about market, right? So when the project started, there was a lot of discussion about, well, what's the value of Salvador? What does Salvador have that's different than other places in Brazil? This Produtor project was in a number of states in the Northeast. This was the first one that was taken up at the municipal level. Well, when you think of Salvador, throw out some thoughts. What do you think about when you think of Salvador Bahia? Those of you who have ever been to Salvador or heard of Salvador, what do you think of? Yes,
I
please.
heard of Salvador, but I've never been there. I don't think this country has a foreign relationship with China. So for us, it's so like unfamiliar.
It's unfamiliar.
Yeah.
Okay, and this is actually Salvador Bahia, which is probably even more unfamiliar. Any thoughts on Salvador? Has anyone ever been to Salvador? Okay, we've got. What did you see when you were in Salvador? What do you remember from Salvador?
I think Salvador is the blackest city outside of Africa with the largest share of Black population outside of Africa. And that you notice in the streets. Also amazing food, amazing culture, amazing music, with a lot of African ingredients, African musical instruments.
Excellent. And some people call Salvador even Black Athens. Well, we started out this discussion because Salvador, the Produtor traditionally is sol y playa, so sun and sand. So we started designing this project as a sun and sand project. What's the challenge? Salvador is a city, so the sand isn't very, very good, right? Because the beach is right on the city. It's not your traditional beach that people would go to as a destination. We started to talk about what is really different about Salvador. And if any of you know the relations in Salvador is very complicated racially, right? A lot of tension historically because of the way the city's been set up, both geographically with segregation. It's actually one of the cities to me that reminds me the most of some of the tensions that you see in a US city, what you would see in Salvador, even though, we understand that it's a city that has a very large Afro-Brazilian population. Well, one of the most successful parts of this project is tourism and Afro-tourism in Salvador, right? This is the plus. You go to Salvador because you want to learn something about this great Black culture that you see. You go there and you see Afro-Brazilian culture, you see Afro-Brazilian people, you see Afro-Brazilian references. And one of the things that we learned through doing the exploration of the tourism sector is that there were a lot of things that were Afro-Brazilian that were kind of hidden. So people didn't know. You would go in somewhere and you'd see pictures of things from Candomblé, which is the traditional Afro-Brazilian religion, or you see references to Shango. People had no idea what this was. So one of the discussion points in the project design is how do you explain enough of the Afro-Brazilian culture so that people can understand what they're actually seeing, but you're not necessarily like giving it all away and you're not pushing it upon people, right? And so there's a subtle difference. So there were certain things that were seen as being off limits. One was tejedos, right? This traditional spiritual communities. When I went to Salvador back in the 80s, you know, one of the first things they do is they want to take you to, or then they wanted to take you to a tejedo. And often you get there and it was very tense because the tour operators had nothing to do with the tejedo. You get there, it feels awkward. They're a bunch of foreigners and basically a very sacred and private religious space. Maybe it's better to look at Afroche, which is o tejedo pra rua, right? So it's basically the traditional space, but it's what comes out at Carnival. It's what's in the streets, it's what's available. Maybe there are ways that you can translate what some of these words are, right? What's one of the big names that you see and hear in Salvador and also in Rio sometimes? Imanja, right? So what does Imanja mean? Can you kind of explain it to someone who's a tourist, not necessarily someone who wants to be bautizado in an Afro-Brazilian religion, but they want to understand, okay, Imanja has something to do with water. Okay, I understand now why people are putting candles in the water. Like there's a certain minimal understanding that you have to have. And a couple of things. So we did roteiros. We did a feminist roteiro. So it was a kind of a tour, a walking tour of things of Afro-Brazilian women and where they were in Salvador. There are other walking tours of traditional spaces for Afro-Brazilians, for traditional even spaces where religious activities happen, but it's all organized and it's all organized by the government. So it's very accessible. People can go onto a site. So one of the things, this is the platform, and there are 1,500 businesses that are involved with this Afro-Biz. So if you go to Salvador, one of the big problems was you didn't know how to find this. Like you had to go to the hotel and ask someone if they knew somebody and then they knew somebody. It's also very difficult for people who don't speak Portuguese to access this information. So this Afro-Biz is a platform that's working. It's very effective. There's also training programs that I'll tell you about a little bit here. There's over 2,000 businesses that have been formally trained in business. They've also received mentorship. So these are some of the ways that you can create structures through the government and through public policy to promote small businesses. Well, what's ended up happening? There's a big shift in how people see tourism. Part of it's the pandemic. We've seen it consistently. Part of what's benefiting Salvador is this. People don't want to go to have an experience that they can have anywhere in the world. They want to have a unique experience. They want to have an experience maybe that they can return to. They want to have an experience that they feel is personal and authentic. What happened with this? People go to Salvador Bahia. They have a wonderful experience. They plan on going back again. They bring their friends, they bring their family, maybe they bring their mom or their dad, their relative, because they had such a wonderful kind of cultural experience. They also then decide, I really like this. I think I'm going to start taking capoeira online. So I'm going to keep hanging out with João every week, and João's going to teach me capoeira at my house. And then you know what? I really like that Dona Maria. She made that great moqueca. I'm going to go to her class online and see how she can, make this moqueca for me. Oh, and Jose did those favela tours. I really miss that area. I'm going to go and take a favela tour. So someone goes out with a GoCam and takes you to the most intimate spots, and you're going into people's houses and you're talking to people and learning about their experiences. So these are all types of tourism that boomed over the pandemic. One of the companies is called Diaspora Black, which has done a tremendous job. It actually started out as Airbnb, like a racially inclusive Airbnb, because so many Afro-Brazilians and African descendant tourists had horrible experiences with Airbnb. They would go in and then they'd be discriminated against. So someone would say, oh, I'm sorry, the room's taken. Or, people would come, guests would come and they'd say, oh, we didn't realize that we'd be staying in this kind of house or in this kind of neighborhood. So they started out in that way, but then they expanded to these virtual experiences, and they even do virtual experiences right now with companies. So companies that are interested in inclusion do these types of experiences. So here are some of the examples. Last year, Salvador Capital Afro was the branding. There's brand new branding that you're gonna see in the next couple of weeks for November. So they're promoting all of the month of November. Why November? November is the month of Black consciousness, but this is a tremendous business strategy for the municipality. Can anyone think of why? What was the economic barrier that was happening in Salvador? I'll tell you. Carnival. Most of these small businesses, particularly the Black businesses, were only making money once a year. At Carnival. And they relied heavily on the municipality to give them money for their art and entertainment activities during that one time of year. This gives them the entire month of November. It gives them activities throughout the entire year. And then they're specializing throughout different months with different types of activities. They're even doing Festas Juninos, so June, so the November. So it's a consistent business strategy, improves the quality of tourism. So the tourism revenue has quadrupled since this program started. Yes.
Yeah, just now Ray said that Salvador was a very few country legalized the Bitcoin as the official currency. Is that true?
We're talking about Salvador Bahia in Brazil.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, this is in Brazil. So, very good. Well, thank you so much. I know we're kind of short on time, so I wanted to make sure that. I appreciate your comments and your questions throughout. Thank you.
Absolutely. So before we wrap up this part of the class, one follow-up question. If you could single out one policy intervention or something that you come across in Brazil that you think the US could learn from.
Good question. One of the things that I often think about is that the US is much more subtle when thinking about equality and particularly around racial equality. There's a program called JAPER, which is a joint action plan between the United States and Brazil to eliminate racial discrimination. There's no equivalent of a CEPIR or some of these policies in the United States. They're within justice, they're embedded in different parts of the federal government and they're kind of mainstreamed or transversalizado. But the idea that you would have a standalone ministry, for me, that was a fascinating experience as someone who's looked at US policy to actually see how do you start an inclusion ministry from scratch? And how do you design it in a way that it can actually be an effective monitor of public policy? So I would say that the boldness of having an inclusion ministry that was used as a reference point really for the entire Americas. And that creation of CEPIR sparked a lot of the discussion even around the Joint Action Plan to eliminate racial discrimination.
And the other way around, is there something in the US that Brazil could be learning from and applying?
It's a good question. I think there's a lot of discussion right now around entrepreneurship and Afro entrepreneurship in particular. I talked a bit about this case of Salvador Bahia. There's also a number of big entrepreneurship programs that are starting out. I think one thing that's been helpful in the United States is there's a designation of businesses that are minority or women owned. And these are like these 8A companies. So what happens is when government is doing supplier diversity, they look and seek out disabled companies and women-owned companies and Afro-American-owned companies. I think a little bit more discussions around procurement at the government level might help diversify both access of businesses and would then diversify the base. Because I hear a lot of the entrepreneurs talking about kind of niche businesses that may be targeting Afro-Brazilians, but if you become a supplier to the government, to some extent, the government has an obligation to buy from a diverse range of companies. When I worked for the federal government, for example, there were a number of suppliers that were disabled companies. So this was a way of kind of giving back, and it's a steady source of income because often the contracts are large and are long-term. So I think that's something that might be interesting to explore a bit more in Brazil and other countries in Latin America.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Judith. And we're stopping the live streaming now. Camila, can you confirm, please?
Yes, I'm stopping the recording now and stopping the live stream.
Thanks so much. All right, so now we enter the second